Next up is our subtropical substrate, 60 to 80% humidity. I think probably hold roughly around there, depending on the climate of your house or wherever the enclosure is. Obviously, ball pythons would live in this area. Most rat snakes will probably live in this area. I have a couple arboreal rat snakes that I would probably keep something like this, but for them, I would use a more tropical substrate, and I'll explain why once I get to that kind of substrate. Corn snakes, I personally would keep in something like this, but yeah, this is meant to just hold humidity, not just a lot of it, but over a longer period of time. I want to purposely make this soil or this substrate less hydrophobic because that means that it'll hold humidity for longer, but simultaneously I do want to make sure that this is not holding water for too long because you don't want your substrate to become too gushy. And the ventilation in your enclosure also plays a role into that, but we'll talk about that more once I get to the tropical substrate. First ingredient up is sphagnum moss. This stuff is really good for retaining humidity. It's not very nutritive. It doesn't really have any other benefit other than just simply being sphagnum moss. It holds humidity pretty well though. So I typically add this to most of my substrates. Sometimes I'll even add it to my arid substrate, just depending on the time of the year when it gets really dry here. But this will be the first thing, pop in. That is roughly the exact mixture too. It's about a 1 maybe to roughly 1. This is about the same mixture I would do sphagnum moss for the type of substrate that's in here. So this was an accurate amount just to size. Next up is peat moss. This is optional because a lot of topsoils already come with peat moss in them. If yours doesn't, you can add this for it's good for plant nutrients. So like I said earlier, you can use this, or you can use other ingredients like this for planted bioactives. But for the most part, if you only want to use this, let's say just for added humidity, you can do that. If it doesn't come on your topsoil and you want to add it, you can do that. If it does, but you want to add a little bit more, you can also do that as well. No big deal. I would say this is about a half ratio to soil that's in there. Optional, play sand. The reason why this is optional is because you won't always need play sand in your substrates, depending on where you are. Some people that are in more arid areas, I would not use play sand up to this point simply because you are going to notice that your substrate dries out too quickly. If you do live in a more humid area, I would personally say that you should use play sand. The reason being, as aforementioned, you want water to dissipate over time. Generally, the more heavy humid your ambient humidity is, not the general moisture of the substrate, the less often or the general less amount of water that's going to come out of your substrate to actually make this less watery, if that makes sense. More or less, we're talking about the differences between whether or not your substrate can release water because there's too much water in the air, or your substrate can release water because there's not that much water in the air. And this is where ventilation comes into play. You want as much ventilation in your enclosure as possible before it leaks too much humidity, because if air is moving, then that means that water can dissipate from the substrate appropriately. If air is not moving, it is stagnant, water is not going to want to release, it's not going to want to condense, and it's not going to want to evaporate, which means over time, you're going to notice that your substrate stays too wet and your air stays too moist, and that's when we get condensation coming down the walls, and we don't want that. So that's what play sand would be used for in this situation. So if you live in a tropical climate, I would use play sand. If you live in a more arid climate like I do, I would probably just leave it out. Next up, pea pebbles. Personally for me, I would say that this is less optional than it is mandatory, simply because, again, this comes down to aeration. And we always want to make sure that our soils, whether we have it planted or non-planted, we always want to make sure that our soils are aerated. Always, no matter what. And the importance of that is both for the health of microbiota, it's for the health of plants, and it's also to make sure that we are allowing water to escape the soil so it's not sitting in the soil. The differences and main differences between planted and non-planted is that ammonia buildup with non-planted is more of an issue than with planted, because plants will naturally cyclize ammonia. And ammonia can exist both in a substrate, it can also exist in the air itself. So it's important to make sure that your substrate is aerated, and equally as important to make sure that your enclosure is ventilated. So I usually add, not a lot, maybe like about that much. One thing that I usually or would add is leaf litter, but I don't have that at the moment, so I can't demonstrate that. You can add leaf litter to this. Leaf litter is optional, but it is more helpful for, again, microbiota. So, you know, isopods, springtails, bacteria, other stuff like that. That's really helpful for adding nutrients to your substrate for those guys. But I unfortunately don't have any, but you can definitely add that if you want. I typically do. Last thing that I don't have on me right now is charcoal, which is important for the same microorganisms I was talking about earlier. I'm gonna go get that right now. All right, we got horticulture charcoal. Again, or I guess I didn't touch on this yet, which is kind of important, but the difference is enough to make a difference. So horticulture charcoal, the difference between this and regular charcoal is that this is broken down from hardwoods. Regular charcoal that you would use for grilling will contain stuff like sulfates, things that you don't want in your substrate because that's a great way to kill your plants. This, because it doesn't contain any other additives, means that you can add this to your substrate and it makes both a great filler for nutrients for your plants and helps with nutrients for any microorganisms you might have in your substrate. So I probably add equal to this, maybe about that much. A little bit in there, about that much. And I'm gonna mix this and I'll be right back. All right, this is roughly what that would look like. I completely forgot to refill my H2O. Shit. But yeah, this is what it'll look like. One thing you'll definitely notice between this and even without water and the more arid substrate is that with sand, there is a big difference in weight. Sand will definitely bog this down in weight more so, and because sand is denser than most of the ingredients that go in here, pretty much all the ingredients actually, sand may sink. If you do mix it correctly and you don't add too much water, typically sand won't drop to the bottom like it usually does, or it does sometimes with some people's mixtures. But this is more or less what that looks like. I'm gonna go get the water because god damn it. All right, I'm back, and you're gonna notice with this substrate, because A, it's fluffier, and B, there are more there's a lot more stuff in here that can hold and retain humidity better. You're gonna notice that this water will disappear pretty much instantly. And it's gone. Just like that. It wastes no time, which is exactly what we want in a substrate like this. I didn't add that much water to it, but this thing will hold water quite well, just because of how we mixed it and how it looks. But this is more or less the mixture I would use for ball pythons. It doesn't get too wet. It doesn't get too dry. It will release water slowly over time. There's plenty of nutrients for microorganisms. Plants will be able to grow in this quite well. And yeah, so we'll be back with our last one, which is our super tropical substrate.